Let's look one more time at money and the quantity of money. So recall the amount of money you want to put into the economy is equal to how many times each dollar bill changes hands. So the total money times how many times it changes hands has got to add up to the amount of GDP. So in the US economy example, if this were $100 of GDP, velocity is about 5, so the dollar changes hands about 5 times on average. So you'd need $20, each changing hands 5 times, that's $100, will allow GDP to stay at 100. Now, this is called the quantity equation of money. Quantity equation of money. What we'd like to look at is how it changes over time. So to convert this into rates of change or growth rates, we convert this into what I call hats, but if you know math, you take a log and you take a derivative with respect to time. And it changes everything into percentage change, which is growth rate. It's very simple. This is the growth rate of the money supply. This is the growth rate or percentage change of velocity. This is the growth rate of the price level. And this is real GDP growth rate. Now economists, this is our real GDP growth. And this is inflation, the growth rate of the price level over time. Economists use pi for inflation, and so I'm going to use that here. One other note. Velocity is how often dollars change hands on average. Fundamentally, that tends to be driven by, over a long period of time, by technology, whether you have more digital cash, less digital cash, ATM cards, credit cards, and so on. In the US, over the last 10 years, the velocity of what we call M1 went from about 8 to about 5. Okay? Over since I think 2010 to 2020. So at any period in time, it's not really changing a lot. If the Fed wants to take it into account, which it would, in this period, it might put a -1 or something. It's declining slowly, but it's a fairly constant change. So most of the time, we will assume for simplicity that it's 0, that it's just constant, that we're down here on this part and it's not changing. For sure, the change in the money supply isn't driving the velocity change. So we can sort of safely ignore it. The second thing I want to point out is our real challenge is not just our simple island economy and how to facilitate trades between all of these individuals, but as this economy grows, right? It's growing out like this. Hopefully, those people are trading and expanding production and growing and growing and growing. Here it's not a physical island, it's our metaphoric GDP. So if it's growing at, say, 5% a year, intuitively, the central bank ought to be producing money at least 5% a year to accommodate GDP in each of those years. So how do they do that? So we're going to suppose the economy's growing already at 5%. We're going to assume velocity is more or less 0, changing is 0, it's constant. So what the central banks usually do is they pick a target inflation rate the current modern popular number is pick a number around 2%. Some central banks will say 2% plus or minus 5, so they'll be 2.5 to 1.5%. Maybe it's exactly 2%, maybe it's a little lower, maybe it's a little higher, but the idea is this. If we aim for inflation to be around 2%, I then take into account the natural growth rate of the economy, and we print money equal to our target plus what we might call the natural rate of growth. In this example, it would be 2% plus the 5% the economy is growing at, and we'll get 7% growth rate of the money supply. So the central bank should be printing money at 7% a year. Why do they do it this way? First of all, we don't know what the real growth rate is going to be over the coming year. We only know what we expect it to be. So they forecast potential and optimal and possible GDP growth and try to figure out what they think the growth rate is going to be. You pick an inflation target a little above 0. So think about it. Over the year, if GDP happened to be a little bit higher, maybe GDP growth was 6%. You didn't print too little money and choke off growth. You only got 1% inflation instead of 2%. Not the end of the world. If GDP growth instead turned out to be a little low that year at only 4%, you picked up a little inflation, which has now gone up to 3%. No problem. We can deal with those issues. So it allows us over time to be putting about the optimal amount of money into the economy, and when our forecasts of GDP are off, and they always are, we get a little more, a little less inflation, but we don't get a bunch of unemployment and we don't collapse the economy. So this is how modern monetary policy generally aims at targeting inflation in order to keep things, it all goes back to attempting to keep this more or less happy and functioning year by year.